When you ask primary school kids what do scientists look like, they have a tendency to draw men in white coats with flasks of bubbling stuff. Those are chemists, or half of chemists anyway. Chemistry and physics are fundamentally different sciences from geoscience and astronomy. The reason is that chemists and physicists can design experiments, and they can repeat those experiments and change little bits each time to understand the full physical processes that are happening. In geology, we can't do that. We live on one planet. We can look at with things like the thing outside. Actually, that doesn't look at planets, does it? That looks at further away. But we can look at other planets. But we live on a planet that has run its course. It's grown through geological processes, and here we are. We can't run that experiment more than once. Like astronomers, geologists have to understand their planet or cosmology through observation, and observation of different things to try and test thought experiments, hypotheses, rather than running the experiments over and over again. And that's why telescopes are so important for cosmology. You're looking at different galaxies and saying, how can we understand how stars form by looking at lots of different galaxies? In geology, we're looking at different parts of the Earth's surface and collecting data from different sites to say, what are the geological processes that made our planet the way it is today? And importantly, as both David and Mike have said, how are we changing our planet? Because we know we've changed our planet. We've been changing our planet pretty much ever since we evolved. You can see the effect on the atmosphere of humans learning agriculture. We changed our atmosphere when we started to grow plants rather than just hunting and gathering. And we're continuing to change our planet now. So this is a really amazing opportunity to develop a geological equivalent of that Jodrell blank telescope, as Mike has said. So it seems crazy when you say, human beings we're kind of familiar with the idea that human beings can change the atmosphere, but how do we change the subsurface? We can change the subsurface in lots of ways. We can induce earthquakes by changing the loads. So if we put a water reservoir on top of a piece of rock that's close to having an earthquake, we can induce earthquakes, or indeed we can actually stop them from happening by increasing the loads depending on the orientation of the fault that might slip. We can induce movement of water from one place to another. If you pump water out of a well, the water is going to want to come in and fill that space that you've left from the surrounding areas. And in coal mining areas, such as Newcastle, where David's from, we know that the pumping of water that's related to, say, Victorian coal mining infrastructure has moved water around. It's taken it from places that are oxygen poor to places that are oxygen rich, and that changes the chemistry of the water. And in places like Glasgow and the central belt of Scotland, you often see these springs that come out of old coal mines that are bright orange because the iron in that water is rusted, it's oxygenated. So we know that activities that we've been taking place, that human beings have been doing in the subsurface for long periods of time, have changed that subsurface. The third way we change the subsurface is there's actually things living down there. There are microbes that live. I think the deepest we've found, and there's a world expert in microbiology in the room, I think is 4 kilometres. Is that right, John? The deepest microbes we found. Yep, 4 kilometres. Excellent. There are bugs living down there. They're tiny, tiny creatures, bacteria like the ones we have in our gut. Most of the time they stay asleep. The life cycle of these things is that they're very, very boring. They do almost nothing for huge periods of geological time until something changes. And that might be a change in the groundwater composition, chemistry, and at which point they wake up and they start doing their thing. They start metabolizing and growing and reproducing. So the changes that we impose on the subsurface, whether that's changes in the stress, the geomechanics, or whether that's changes in the chemistry in terms of flowing groundwater, also changes the populations of bugs that live under the ground. And interestingly, there's a possibility we could use that to our advantage. And increasingly, engineers are looking at how we can use those bugs, those natural populations of bugs, to do useful things. So some of those bugs, if you feed them the right food, they will actually metabolize and produce minerals. And those minerals can be used to seal up fractures or to glue sand together and stabilize rocks or stabilize soils like dikes around rivers. So we not only can have changes on the affect changes on the subsurface, but we can actually, if we understand those changes, make them do useful things for us. So Mike's nicely covered the kind of applications that we have in the subsurface. All of these applications that Mike's talked about require an understanding of that, how we will change the mechanics of the rock, how we might change the chemistry of the rock, and what the implications are for the geomicrobiology. So Mike gave an example of compressed air energy storage. So I'll just talk you through that one a bit. Compressed air energy storage means putting compressed air into rocks. So if you think of rocks as being like a sponge, if you put water in a sponge, you're filling the little holes in the sponge up with water. If you squeeze that sponge, the water will come out. So if you blow a sponge up with air, it'll expand. But rocks can't expand very much because they're under huge weight. So that creates stress in the rock. That will do something to the mechanics. As you take the air out again, the sponge is going to shrink back down again. That might allow water to move back into the pores of the rock. And moving water will change the rock chemistry and do things to the bugs. Now, a real problem might be is if those bugs then start to precipitate minerals and close up those pores. That was something we want to avoid. So we need to understand how those bugs will respond to the changes in stress and the changes in chemistry. Conversely, those bugs might do useful things for us. They might precipitate out minerals in such a way that it holds that sponge open, so that repeated cycles of injecting air and producing air means the rocks are actually worn less. They last for longer. They're a useful resource for longer. These are all kinds of technologies that we know the basic science of. We know how to understand what questions to ask, but we've never done that before. We've never used rocks in that very cyclical way. We've either gone in and taken coal out or oil out, or we've put stuff in, wastewater disposal. But that idea of cycling through stress changes and chemistry changes is a really new application for the subsurface. And we need to understand those responses really quite well in order to be able to forecast how long those resources might last. So I'm the chair of the Science Advisory Group for the UK GEOS, and we were formed initially to set up what's called the Science Plan. And the Science Plan, if you like, is the overarching science themes for commissioning this new infrastructure. You had to understand what science you wanted to do before we could even think about how many boreholes we needed and what depth they were and so on. We were named the GSAG. We've actually had many names, but GSAG is our final name that we've settled on. We ignored ISAG. That was going to be Independent Science Advisory Group. Thankfully, we're not ISAG. We are GSAG. And GSAG met to define these key science themes. What are the overarching science questions that we need in order to be able to commission these sites? So our 4 overarching science themes were understanding how we image the rock mass. By rock mass, I mean the rocks and the cracks in the rocks and the water in the rocks. And by imaging, there's a whole host of different technologies. If you've ever watched Time Team, you know, the geophys team that go out on Time Team with Tony, Baldrick from, Tony Robinson. You know, there are different ways of imaging the subsurface, just like there are different ways of imaging the human body in a hospital. And those technologies are advancing all the time. CAT scanners and NMR scanners that are used for imaging people are now used for imaging rocks in the lab, and we're starting to understand how we can roll those types of technology out to use them in the field in situ. So there's a lot of science and technology questions around how you do that imaging. There's some really exciting stuff about how you use different imaging technologies at the same time. So can we take seismic data, 3D seismic data, and co-invert that with electrical resistivity data in order to get a better understanding of what we're imaging. And we need to be able to do that as the rock is evolving, as those human-induced changes are happening. Actually, not just human-induced changes. The site in Cheshire is tidal. There's an estuary there, and we'll be able to image the influence of the rock mass of the tides. And Earth has tides too. As the moon goes around the Earth, it pulls the rocks as well as the water. Multi-phase flow and heterogeneous rocks. Multi-phase means we're not just looking at water moving through a water-saturated rock. those rocks will have other types of fluids in. So they might have a mix of fresh water and saline water, especially in estuarine areas where you're pumping salty water in every time the tide goes up and down. But there's gas in there too, and some of those gases are the natural in situ gases that we produce as those rocks are cooked and buried, the methane, carbon dioxide, hydrogen sulfide. But we're interested in how the gases that we might want to put in, so getting rid of CO2, how that reacts with the rock. Heterogeneous is because rocks are incredibly spatially variable. If you talk to any geotechnical engineer who's been involved in opening up foundations for a new building, they will tell you that site investigations are almost always wrong. And you drill little holes and you say, that we think we're going to find this when we build our foundations. This actually happened at the University of Strathclyde, our second most recent building. They thought they had coal measures, which is what's under Glasgow and under Cheshire, and then they had a big hard lump of igneous rock. When they opened it up, it turned out they'd modelled it wrong, and they had to completely redesign the foundations in order to hold the building up. That's really common in civil engineering, because boreholes on their own give you little line samples through something that's very, very variable. That's why the imaging thing is very important. Okay. I don't know, there's someone behind the curtain. Mechanical, biological and geochemical response to change. So those are the sort of three areas of science that are very, very interacting. If you change the mechanics, you can drive chemical reactions. If you change the chemistry, you can make the biology do different things. So these very interlinked processes will respond to changes that we induce on the rock. And then finally, and not the least important by any means, is how those subsurface interactions change the surface. So if we're going to be injecting compressed air into rocks and cycling, pulling it out again to power our nation when the wind's not blowing, is that compressed air cycling going to do anything to the rock mass that might let something bad up, some deep salty water? Rocks are very salty. That deep salty water, is that going to come up into the shallow aquifers, as Mike said? In Cheshire, we've got an aquifer, we've got a cap rock, we've got the resource. How are those cap rocks going to behave over that long-term cycling? If that gas makes it through, will it just come straight up? Will it go out sideways? How does the very shallow part of the subsurface influence how any potential contaminants might make it to the surface? So if we want to do this safely and at scale, all of these decarbonisation technologies are going to need to be done at really significant scale to replace fossil fuels. We need to understand how to de-risk that process, how to monitor it properly. Let's say if gas escapes through the cap rock, is it going to come straight up or sideways? That's a very different monitoring challenge. If you think it comes straight up, you can put all your sensors there. If you think it's going to go sideways, you need to put your sensors in a wider area. So fundamentally, how we monitor and regulate these industries means we need to understand the physics, the chemistry, the biology. So the Geoscience Advisory Group, GSAG, is made up of UK academics from some of the UK's top universities. We have members from industry who are highly experienced in doing stuff to the subsurface. And we have members from the key regulators who are along there to help us understand how our science is likely to be regulated and how our science can inform regulation. And I've cut and pasted some bits from our terms of reference. Our basic remit is to provide expert independent science advice to the BGS and the Natural Environmental Research Council as the plans have developed. So we've been meeting 4 times a year. We've been getting updates from the BGS about how their plans have evolved. And when there are certain key decisions, we've been given the independent science advice that says, for some reason or another, this borehole location has had to be moved. What are the implications for science? Are we still going to be able to answer some of those really fundamental questions if that borehole's put here rather than there? The BGS have to deal with the sort of pragmatics on the surface, and we're trying to give them that independent, we're not trying, we are giving them that independent science advice. We're also expected to go out and bring in the science views of the wider community. And David has been particularly important in that role as senior science user. He has time to go out and consult with a wide array of different types of scientists to ensure that we are capturing the excitement and the really cutting edge research from a wide variety of science disciplines. We've also been involved in bringing in this international dimension, and this isn't the first time people have done scientific experiments in the subsurface. It is the first time that something's been done at this scale and this ambition. But around the world, there are a number of places where people have been doing experiments on the subsurface. So one example is the Otway site in Australia, where they've been looking at what happens when you put CO2 underground and deliberately letting it leak to say, you know, as it leaks through the ground, where does it go? How does it move? How might we best monitor that leakage? So Mike, very early on, was involved in going out and visiting a lot of these international sites and learning from their best practice, learning from their mistakes. But we've also been bringing them in as we've gone along to give us their advice. And it's been really brilliant that these people, to a person, I won't say to a man, because over half of them are women, have been really excited about this. And in fact, Susan Havorka, who is the scientist who's probably shoved more CO2 in the ground than anyone else in the world, she's an American scientist from Texas who's developed a lot of the very early experiments around CCS. She came over for a meeting about UK GEOS. At the end of the meeting, she said, I'm going back to the US Department of Energy and asking if we can have one. I want one of these, this is ace. Tom Daly, who worked very closely with Susan, gave a really nice analogy. He said, in universities, we like labs. We like labs to do experiments in. Let's go back to the physicists and chemists. And a lab really is just a room with some stuff in it. And that stuff changes over time. So you might have an analytical chemistry lab that has machines in it, mass spectrometers and all sorts of things. But those go out of date. New machines become available, new techniques become available. It's still the same lab as that thing evolves. And Tom Daly from Texas was particularly impressed by the vision that this is a 15-year laboratory. It's not a fixed piece of infrastructure. The initial capital spend will put some boreholes down with some sensors in, but as somebody invents, as someone in my university is looking at quantum sensors for gravity, and gravity is a measure of how dense something is, how much it pulls you. So as the rock expands and contracts, it will have a different gravitational attraction to sensors. These are really novel. They're not things you can now dangle down boreholes, but they're working very closely with the borehole dangling community to develop sensors that you can put down boreholes, and this is going to be a brilliant place to test and validate those types of sensors. So the kit will evolve through time, but the infrastructure is that room that will host all of those pieces of equipment. So to kind of reiterate what Mike said, the sites in Cheshire and Glasgow will be these observatories that allow us to look down instead of looking up. They will comprise the boreholes themselves, the sensors and monitoring equipment that goes down the boreholes and around them. There'll be networks of air quality sensors at the surface as well as the boreholes. And the data is really important. There are data scientists out there who are dying to get hold of really good quality long-term time series analyses of data from particular sites and look at complicated mathematical algorithms for how you study that data. You can tell I'm really starting to reach the limits of my own understanding, but this stuff is really cool. They're using the kind of technologies that people use in the gaming industry to understand how people interact with computer games. This is an incredibly ambitious project, and with anything that's ambitious, there will be things that go a little bit wrong. You know, we're expecting things will happen that we weren't expecting, but scientists are really good at taking those kinds of things and making them into positives. And a project I worked on where we had a seismometer down a borehole that got stuck, we couldn't get it back out. There was a bit of fancy engineering going on, and lo and behold, we can't get it back out, but we can still use it to give us data about how the rocks have changed. That ambition means that we are directly linking into answering research questions that will make a difference to people's lives and to industry. And one of the very exciting things about this project is the links to industry. And Michelle Bentham, who you saw on the film, is building the innovation strategy for the UK GEOS sites. How do we engage with companies to get them excited to come here and use our site to test their technologies? And how can we push small companies that are building new sensors? How can we provide them a leg up to actually get their sensors to market faster? So we will work with companies, we will work with different research councils to develop proposals for research to be run at these centres. Just like astronomers working at Jodrell Bank will be putting in research proposals for their PhD students to come here and go and look at that particular galaxy. The science community will be doing the same thing. So the group that I chair, the Science Advisory Group, is heavily involved in trying to disseminate that knowledge out to the scientists, so they're engaged and excited as well. So I think I'm going to leave it there.
Thank you very much, Zoe.